Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Morgan Szabo, the Climate Health Communications and Outreach Coordinator with the Climate Program Office at NOAA. I'm here to welcome you to the third webinar in the series presented by the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, NIHIS, Urban Heat Island Community of Practice Series. In the first webinar, we learned about the physical hazard of extreme heat over several spatial scales. The second webinar, Constructing Heat Vulnerability Indices, looked at assessing vulnerability, heat, and risk. Both of these webinars coincided in the first two steps of the Climate Toolkit Steps to Resilience. In today's webinar, we will be exploring Step 3 of the Toolkit, Investigative Options. This step examines possible solutions to the highest risks and builds a list of options through brainstorming and checking how other communities have responded to similar issues through inclusive community discussions. To discuss this topic, we have three fantastic speakers here with us today, starting with Victoria Ludwig of the EPA. She will highlight case studies of local government policies, incentives, regulations, and other approaches to help advance the implementation of heat island mitigation measures. Then we will move on to two case studies. The first will be Integrating Heat into Policy in the District of Columbia by Melissa Diaz. Then we will hear from Courtney Anderson on Denver strategies for addressing the urban heat island. Following the presentation, we will have ample time for Q&A session moderated by Victoria. Before we begin, just a few reminders. All the sessions will be recorded and posted to the NIHIS website and YouTube page. We encourage you to post questions using the chat function on GoToWebinar, which you can see in the control panel. So to kick off this webinar, our first presentation will be from our moderator, Victoria. Victoria Ludwig is the National Program Manager of the Environmental Protection Agency's Heat Island Reduction Program, and also supports the agency's state and local energy environment program. In these capacities, she provides technical and outreach support to local governments and other stakeholders on mitigating heat islands and implementing local climate solutions. I will now hand it over to Victoria to take it away. Off to you, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Megan. I'm going to show my screen. Hi, everyone. So great to be with you. I'm going to be very short with my presentation because I want the most time to go to Courtney and Melissa and to your questions and answers. But thanks for being here. This is a talk on sort of where the rubber hits the road for heat island mitigation. I'm going to explain a little bit about what EPA does in this space and then give a quick summary of the types of policies that local governments have and can use to reduce their, cool down their cities. First of all, under our Heat Island program, which has been around for about 20 years, we have all of the classic tools, websites, newsletter, webinars, and I just wanted to point out as far as our website, we have some new features if you haven't looked lately. We're trying to keep on top of what's going on in this space and the important issues to you, the communities. We have a page on the connection between heat islands and equity, and how local governments are navigating that challenge right now to address the inequities in how heat affects community residents. We have recently updated our webpage that focuses on the impacts of heat islands, the health, environmental, economic impacts. We have some new science that we found to provide some concrete information on how heat islands, what their effects are on our lives. And this summer we have a web page on social media. We have about 6 graphics that you are welcome to download now and put out on all your channels. They are in Spanish and English, and they focus on a variety of, there's a picture of one down at the bottom right. This one shows what everyone can do for heat islands, but there are others that talk about some of the specific mechanisms and as well. Our compendium of strategies is a very detailed guide on everything you always wanted to know but were afraid to ask about heat islands. There are 6 chapters, and I just wanted to point out in bold there, 1 chapter is devoted exclusively to case studies of what's going on at the local level and what the different policies are. We lay out the different options that are available for implementing strategies to actually make cities more resilient to heat, and those I'm going to give a quick summary of next. We also have a database of some actions that are going on right now at the local and state level. I'm always interested in expanding that. So if anyone has some activities they're working on, please let me know and we'd be happy to add you to that database. It's meant to sort of be a inventory of some of what's going on right now. And we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and to hear about our new webinars, which are announced in the newsletter. So I think you guys have heard this maybe in some previous presentations, but within the interventions to the built environment that are enacted to keep our surfaces and our buildings and our surroundings cool, they fall into these 5 categories. Trees and vegetation are, I think, by far the most popular, that are most widely used. Increasing those, installing more cool roofs, highly reflective roofs. Green roofs are quite popular more and more. And then cool pavements are kind of the new cutting edge here in the US, and those can be highly reflective or permeable. Smart growth is something that we encourage people to look at because it's a way to sustainably develop our urban areas in a way that improves livability, walkability, and also incorporates a lot of these heat mitigation options, so that even though the city might be rough, densely packed or designed, it can still be cool and have a reduced heat island. The 2 buckets in general that are available to local governments for almost everything they do are voluntary and regulatory. And these regulatory options, the voluntary ones, excuse me, these are just a few. And they range from the classic outreach and education, things that governments do to raise awareness of these issues. Those are kind of standard for most everything. Financial incentives, local governments are getting more creative. A few examples are giving rebates for the construction of cool roofs. A lot of utilities also do that, actually, and that helps reduce energy. There are tax abatements in some communities for planting trees when you are constructing a new building. Some communities, if you are installing a green roof, they will give you preferential permitting, which most developers love because it helps them go through the permitting process a lot faster. Many, many cities give away trees and do workshops on tree planting and care. Grants, some localities just give money for demonstration projects and tree plantings like you see here. They give those to community groups, businesses. Award competitions, some of the classic things that local governments can do to encourage behavior change in a way that reduces heat islands. On the regulatory side, these are just a few, again, for those localities that have control over their building and energy codes. They have a wide variety of options. One that is listed here, Los Angeles has been doing. They require that new homes in the city put on a cool roof. The utility will give a rebate, so that helps. But this is kind of an innovative way, at least as far as the residential sector is concerned. Zoning laws, oftentimes if you have a parking lot, you are required to have shading, or sometimes the size of your parking lot is restricted in order to just save space, but also reduce hard surfaces. Tree protection and landscaping mandates, several cities and counties require you to get a permit before you remove a tree. And stormwater management, as we'll hear about from both of our speakers, even though a lot of those laws around increasing green infrastructure are focused on reducing stormwater runoff, they do have a heat island impact. And so this is a way to also encourage heat reduction through some of the stormwater regulations that are out there. So I wanted to be quick. Here's my information. Please reach out and love to keep talking to you guys after this webinar. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can pull up my notes. 1 second. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm ready to go with our first speaker. Melissa Diaz is the Acting Chief Resilience Officer for the District of Columbia. She leads efforts to ensure that DC builds resilience to sudden shocks, such as hurricanes and cyber attacks, and also chronic stresses, such as inequality and weakened infrastructure. And previously, she oversaw the implementation of Climate Ready DC, which is the district's climate preparedness plan. So Melissa's going to tell us the city is currently developing a comprehensive heat plan, and she's going to talk about the policy options that they're considering, as well as some of the analysis that underlies the plan. So looking forward to hearing from you, Melissa. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Victoria, for that introduction. So I, like was just said, I'm going to talk through our heat plan that is forthcoming. So it is in draft form now, so it should be released sometime in the coming months. One note that I should make is that I have changed agencies within the last year, and so our comprehensive heat plan is actually coming out of our Department of Energy and Environment, even though I'm now with our Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. We do work closely together, but I just want to make sure that DOEE gets credit for this work. All right. So what I'm going to do today is just quickly talk through why we're doing a comprehensive heat plan, what we used to develop that plan, a quick overview of what currently is in the plan. It is in draft stage, so it could change a little bit, but I think this will be pretty accurate to what actually ends up in there, and then some of the challenges that we're running into. So I'll go through a lot of this pretty quickly because I think I am preaching to the choir here, but we recognized that we needed to do a comprehensive heat plan because while climate change and extreme heat are featured in our Climate Ready DC plan and in our Resilient DC plan, we didn't quite get into the detail around extreme heat. We also found through some of the initial work on implementation that not a single agency owned extreme heat because it really touches so many different facets of the community, from health risks to environmental risks to public safety risks. And so we wanted to bring together all of the different agencies and stakeholders that have a role to play in heat and work together to develop a plan. So from the very beginning, it was an interagency process. So the heat plan draws on some of the mapping and modeling that I know the last webinar focused on. So I'll run through this pretty quickly, but we did have the NOAA pilot of looking at the urban heat island and have used the ambient air temperature map that they created in all of our work to really identify where to focus in on strategies and what the issues are within the district. We layered in information on demographics, and we actually created a few different versions of a sensitivity and exposure map. So the sensitivity map is really showing the demographic characteristics. So it looks at age, pre-existing health conditions, income, race, all of the things that we know increase your sensitivity to heat. And then our exposure map takes that ambient air temperature map and also adds in information about our tree canopy and impervious surface. And then we created a combination map. And we actually have a couple different versions of this combination map, one that overemphasizes heat sensitivity, one that emphasizes heat exposure, and then the one that you're seeing here is 50-50. And the reason why we did that is because if we're doing policies that really target the heat island, we might want to focus those on areas that have high exposure. And if we're doing policies that target more social programs, we might want to focus more on areas of high sensitivity. So we wanted to look at all of those factors. We also did a follow-on to our heat mapping work with Vivek Chandas, the same researcher that's behind some of that work, to really try and understand which interventions actually make a difference when it comes to reducing the urban heat island. And underpinning that was a question about affordable housing. So the district has a goal of building a lot more affordable housing in the district, and we have the question of, can we both support our affordable housing goals and our urban heat goals, and understand a little bit more about which interventions work in the process? And so we looked at 3 different blocks throughout the district. I'll go through 2 of those where there was going to be housing built, and said, can we do something to increase affordable housing and decrease heat at the same time. So this block actually is one where there was no slated redevelopment. It's already affordable housing. And so we just asked, what can we do to make that area more comfortable? And we looked at adding lots of trees. We looked at adding a water feature. We looked at cool pavements, and really found here that trees were the only thing that made a significant difference. Here we looked at a plot where there on the left is what is currently there in terms of the affordable housing development, but it's slated for a complete redevelopment. And then we looked at a couple of different plans for how that property could be redeveloped. So the middle one is showing all high rise, and then the one all the way to the right is showing a variable building height, same number of units in both of those. And then we also looked at trees versus no trees. All of them have green roofs in accordance with our regulations, and are making sure that they're meeting our stormwater requirements. And we found here that the variable building heights actually also made a difference, in addition to the trees, because the variable building heights created shade. So some lessons that we learned from this is that trees really were the big winner, while green roofs and cool roofs may have an impact on the building efficiency and may be useful at scale. And that's something that we're actually looking into with the EPA. At a single block level, as we were looking, they didn't seem to have a big impact on pedestrian level heat and thermal comfort. And we also found that density and heat can coexist. So the third one that we looked at was actually a totally vacant property, and what happens if we added a building to what is now a grassy field, and we were able to decrease the urban heat island in that property. And so that was really encouraging, though all of that to say with the caveat that this is all modeled results, and should be verified with real life measurements. So that's the next step. And then the final piece of feedback that went into our heat plan was community feedback. So we had to pivot a little bit about what we were doing to collect community feedback because we were doing this in the midst of a pandemic. But what we ended up doing was holding 4 2-hour focus groups with those communities that are most sensitive to the heat. So we had one that was a Spanish language focus group, one that focused on people who have experienced homelessness or service providers that work with people who experience homelessness, and then 2 that really focused on some of our lower income neighborhoods and elderly residents and residents who live in public housing, and just learned a ton through these focus groups. Nuances like that our housing authority actually charges extra for people to have a window AC unit during the summer, and that's prohibitive for a lot of people. And so that provided a lot of context for what we did. And then we also wanted to have something that was a little bit more representative. So we did a survey that was an electronic survey, and that was specifically aimed at getting a good demographic mix of the city and the different neighborhoods. So what's in the plan? We've divided the strategies into 2 basic chapters. Strategies on things that reduce the urban heat island, and then strategies recognizing that no matter what we do, we're still going to have hot days. So how do we keep people safe? And so I'm just going to run through some of the broad categories and then talk in more detail about some of these. But in the cooling down, it's a focus on increasing cool spaces where people feel heat the most. So where people are outside, where people are really exposed. Using the modeling study that we did to think about how we can better design for heat. Enhancing tree equity, we already have really ambitious tree goals. How do we make sure that we're layering in equity considerations into those tree goals and taking the feedback that we learned from our focus groups that if we're going to have places that have trees, they need to be well maintained, they need to feel safe, they need to be well lit. So thinking through all of those characteristics. And then the 4th one is to continue studying the urban heat island and better understanding it. So digging into a couple of these. So for increasing cool spaces, our policy tool that we have here is really partnerships and mainstreaming. So we're working with our Department of Parks and Rec to make sure that every time they're redesigning a park, that they're thinking about shade, that they're thinking about splash parks, that they're thinking about trees. Working with our Department of Transportation to think about how we can do cooling and shade along those transit corridors that are most heavily trafficked, where there's lots of pedestrians, lots of people out. Working with our public schools to figure out how, when we're doing schoolyard design, we're thinking about cooling. So that's really just integrating it into things that we're already doing. When it comes for designing for heat, that's when there's more of that regulatory space and a way of using strategic capital investments. So I have lots of words on this slide that I won't read, but basically we have different tools in place. So we have something called the Green Area Ratio as an example, which is a zoning tool that basically requires that all property meet a certain number of points when they are doing a development, and you can get points through putting a green roof, and you get different points if it's intensive versus extensive. You get points for ground level stormwater management practices. You get points for preserving a tree. So how can we use the information that we have about heat to tweak what point values we're giving to all of those things so that we're encouraging people to do the things that are best for cooling? And then in the capital investments phase, like how can we make sure that every time the district is spending money on something that we are being a good role model and thinking about cooling in that. So then in the staying safe section, we have a few different strategies on improving cooling centers, education, supporting safety in the home, and then supporting safety outdoors and ensuring reliable power. Digging into a couple of these, so supporting safety at home. This was one of the things that we really heard from our focus group and from our survey, was that people did not want to leave their house to get cool. They wanted to stay home. So what can we do to make sure that people have access to cool spaces where they actually live? And so one of the things in the regulatory space that we're looking for is setting a maximum air temperature. There are a couple of cities that have done this. And so we're looking to them as models. It's a pretty new cutting edge thing for cities to do, that while we have minimum habitability requirements for the winter, we don't have that same thing for the summer. So can we do that? And that would really get to the rental properties and some of the challenges that renters in particular face. But there's also a lot that we should just do through education and outreach. For example, a lot of people don't know the low-cost cooling techniques that are most effective for their home. They don't know just the basics of ventilation. So making sure that we are putting out materials on how to do that, and then also expanding our HVAC assistance program and really thinking about how we reach communities that may not think that they're eligible, like people who are undocumented. And then in the ensuring reliable power, that's where we're really looking at using microgrids and solar and storage and thinking about backup power. One of the things that we also learned through our conversations is that sometimes our cooling centers lose power, and we don't size our generators to think about the HVAC and keeping that on. So do we need to rethink that? Do we need to equip those facilities with solar and storage and some sort of larger backup power? And then also we need to work with our utility to make sure that we're protecting the grid. So just to finish off, one way that we're implementing already is that we developed resilient design guidelines, where we took our high heat days and translated those into cooling degree days, which is how building developers think. So that allows our building developers to right size HVAC units. So that has been an effective first step. Some challenges, I think these, I won't go super deep into a lot of these because you all know that funding is a challenge, providing heat related benefit cost analyses is a challenge. But some of the things that we face as a district is, getting the political will to do some of the regulatory changes that we need to do. Just making sure that residents are vocal about the challenges that they're facing. And then the nuances of implementation. For example, we have a cool roof ordinance that requires cool roofs on all new residential buildings, but it's not necessarily well enforced or well advertised. And so sometimes it doesn't happen. And also people just have one roof and they have many decisions about what to do with that one roof. And then one final example of a challenge is that we are often relying on our stormwater goals to implement our different heat strategies, because stormwater interventions also often provide heat benefits, but a lot of those are paid for by stormwater credits, which actually encourage work in the areas in the periphery of our city where we don't have a combined sewer, which happens to be an exact inverse of our heat island, which is just one of the challenges that we face when trying to use that policy mechanism. So I will wrap. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melissa. I commend you on all the hard work you guys have to do. And I hope that we can keep working together at EPA to maybe help you guys. That's the goal. We appreciate the challenge you have, but great work so far. It's awesome to see the successes. Thanks everybody for submitting some questions. Keep those up. We'll do a Q&A after the next speaker. And I just wanted to say, I think Morgan will address this again, but there will be these presentations posted on the NIHIS website. So stay tuned for that. So no need to, you can get them later and study them at your leisure. Let's move on to the next great example and great speaker. Courtney Anderson is her name, and she leads the Net Zero Energy New Buildings and Homes program for the city and the county of Denver, Colorado. In that capacity, she works to ensure that Denver is on track to meet its climate goals. Not an easy thing. Her background as an architect includes experience in green building consulting, sustainability, codes and standards, design, and many other aspects. Courtney's going to talk today about the codes and regulations in Denver that they use to regulate their urban heat island. She's going to focus primarily on their new green building ordinance, which includes a variety of mechanisms to make it easier for compliance. So we look forward to your presentation, Courtney. You can take it away.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you, Melissa, for that great presentation. So as Victoria mentioned, I'm going to kind of run through the strategies that Denver has recently implemented to mitigate urban heat island effect. So it's really helpful to understand the background and why this is so impactful to Denver. Why does it matter? So in, sorry, my screen. So here's the projection into temperature change. So in 1970, we were looking at 6 days that were 95 degrees or more. And now we're projected to be 79 degrees by 2080. So that's, if we continue on the same emissions trajectory, it's really going to start to change our climate. So looking at the climate and we're going to be about 11% hotter by 2100. So instead of the typical Denver climate, you're going to be feeling like you're in southern Texas. So right now, Denver has about 30% of people do not have air conditioning. So as the climate gets warmer, more people will be at risk, and safety and equity are going to be large issues we need to deal with. So Denver created a heat vulnerability map combining several measures of built environments, demographics, and human health, similar to what you saw in Melissa's presentation. So we're looking at different ways to map it, like impermeable surfaces, the tree canopy, household isolation, so people that are living by themselves, the elderly population, different disabilities, poverty, race, all of these combined to create this heat vulnerability index. So this is a composite measure of those previous maps you just saw. So this map really allows and helps us to compare and get a better understanding of how specific populations will be affected, and to help identify those possible opportunities for intervention to help mitigate climate change. We also looked at the surface temperature. So this is the daytime surface temperature. You can see where downtown Denver is. It's kind of along the spine, the red cluster spine on the northwest side. And then also looking at what's the nighttime temperature. So you can really start to see how that cluster of red, and that's towards downtown Denver, it really doesn't cool down during the nighttime. It doesn't give people the chance to kind of recover from those really hot days. And so to help mitigate urban heat island effect, an analysis of the regulation structure can really help to identify those opportunities. So we've got the codes and regulations, and then we have ordinances such as the zoning code and the green building ordinance, as well as the Denver building and fire codes. So things like the I codes, which are mandatory, like the IECC, the IBC, as well as the Denver Green Code, which is a voluntary code. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Green Building Ordinance in the next couple slides. So what is the Green Building Ordinance? You know, it was created from this citizen-led green roof initiative that passed in 2017. It did have a lot of challenges because it really, the language is copied from Toronto, so it created some legal conflicts. It conflicted with state water laws. It conflicted with building code regulations and definitions within the code. So there was a task force created to help transition that green roof initiative into the Green Building Ordinance. We work with stakeholders, more flexible options to make sure that because this is a requirement, how does everybody meet these requirements? And making sure it honored that original vote of the Citizen Green Roof Ordinance. So finally, the Green Building Ordinance passed in 2018, and it approved the rulemaking in 2019. So the Green Building Ordinance is for buildings over 25,000 square feet. So all of those buildings are required to have a cool roof and one of these options. So in the center of the screen, you can start to see the options for the new buildings. And then on the right side, you can start to see the existing building requirements. And you only have to follow one of these paths because you also have to do a cool roof. So things like installing green space or green roof, paying into a green building fund, which then Denver would build green space within the city, looking at solar, energy efficiency, and certification. So those are very similar on both sides of new buildings and existing buildings. They do have different thresholds, but the existing building also has this energy program in that orange color you see. So this actually breaks it down to 5 more options for buildings. Again, because it's a requirement, we want to make sure that buildings do have the opportunity to comply. That's not making it easy, but it's giving them the opportunity to meet their requirements. So this energy program for existing buildings, there's an Energy Star score option, an EUI improvement based on your square footage, off-site, on-site solar, and different certification levels. So the benefits from the Green Building Ordinance is helping to reduce that urban heat island. You know, we're adding more green space, so there's less impermeable surfaces, more trees, and then it's also addressing the water and stormwater management, and as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions through all the different compliance options. So here's the Green Building Ordinance and who it applies to. So I've mentioned that it's for buildings over 25,000 square feet. It's for new buildings, so all new buildings that meet that square footage. For existing buildings, but only at roof replacement. So when they're going to replace the roof, they have to apply for the permit in a certain way that requires them to do a cool roof, as well as choose one of those compliance options, as well as it applies to additions, and there's different requirements for the square footage. So going back to the codes and regulations that we have, the Denver Building and Fire Code, as I mentioned, has the I codes and the Denver Green Code, which is voluntary. And this code is a stretch code that's updated every 3 years. It allows the community to really test provisions and become familiar with those before eventually and possibly they get moved into mandatory. So after those 3-year cycle, provisions are evaluated to see what can be moved to mandatory code. So maybe something goes into zoning or into the base codes, the I codes. And then in that same cycle, we're looking at how to add more progressive provisions into the Denver Green Code to really reflect the community's vision for Denver. So currently we're in the middle of the code adoption process. And I'm not sure how many of you are from Denver, but I'll try to make this pretty general as a process. So we just finished up our working groups with the community. So we had a series of community working groups where we talked about energy and sustainability. So from there, we're developing proposals based on those meetings and what we heard from the community, as well as we accepted applications from anyone in the public. So anyone could submit their own idea for a code concept. So now we're gearing up to start these code committee meetings in January. And then from there, we'll be reviewing all these proposals, and hopefully we'll have a city council vote by the end of summer 2022. So because we're going through the code adoption process right now, these are proposals for the Denver Green Code. So these are ideas that we are looking at implementing either into the Denver Green Code or hopefully maybe into mandatory. So it depends on how the code committees respond to some of these items. So things like requiring street trees in the right-of-way, tree preservation requirements, different allowances for rock mulch, and wall shading calculations through these different strategies like using plants, even on-site renewable, making sure that the structure is shaded, as well as looking at single-family lot coverage. I'm sorry, I realized I jumped a slide ahead. So this is what I'm looking at right now. So these are the items that we're looking at for those proposals. And if I go back, this is the item that is currently within the Denver Green Code. So the mitigation of the heat island. So there's a requirement so that 50% of your hardscape has to meet some combination of these things. So existing trees, making sure there's vegetation, SRI requirement, permeable pavers, and shading through structures. So thank you very much for participating in this webinar. I hope to answer any questions you guys may have. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Courtney. I think you've illustrated very well the multiple challenges, environmental challenges that local governments face and how they need to be creative in finding solutions that address more than one of those while at the same time addressing citizens' needs. And so congratulations. And thanks for everyone being concise because we have a good 20 minutes for questions. And we have had several. Folks, please keep them coming, and if you can direct them at a speaker, please do that. And also just want to point out in the chat pane or the Q&A pane, you'll see that NOAA folks have put the address of the website where the presentations will be posted. Okay, so let's open the questions. Let's see. Who is my first victim? Just kidding. Well, first I'll mention an FYI from Mark Hartman at Phoenix. Thanks for letting us know that Phoenix has a maximum air temperature requirement for landlords at 82 degrees, which is really great. Good example. Thanks. How about Melissa? there's an easy one, I think, and then maybe a more complex one. Will the city, the community heat ambassadors be volunteers?
Yeah, so what we're currently talking about is using our CERT program. So our community, oh my gosh, I'm now blanking on what that stands for. But we currently use those volunteers to shovel sidewalks for elderly members of the community during snow days. And so the question is, can we do something very similar with our CERT volunteers during high heat days where they're going and checking on people that we know might be at more risk. So that's the current plan, is to use that existing network. But we're also, I'm sure as we get into implementation, might find some additional ideas.
Okay, great, thanks. And another one for you is, what software model did you use for your affordable housing scenarios that you showed? Was it a customized tool for the district, or can it be applied elsewhere?
Yeah, so I am not the technical expert on the specific software. We worked with Vivek Shandas, who is out of Portland, and Kappa Strategies is the company that he works with. We had a small grant, and he did the analysis using some software that his team has developed. Okay,
great. Well, I'll go back and forth here. Courtney, a question, is this part of Denver's zoning code? I assume that means the green building ordinance, but any way you can answer that would be good.
So the green building ordinance is separate from the zoning code. That's just a standalone ordinance, a requirement. Things in the zoning code is what we hope to move from the Denver Green Code into the zoning code. So because the Denver Green Code is voluntary, we're hoping some of those provisions can make it into the zoning. But to answer your question, it is separate from the zoning code.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. Sorry guys, let me make it bigger. There's another one for you, I thought. Maybe this is for both of you. Did the heat island study influence the regulatory measures that you put in place, like white roofs? I think that might be for both of you, but you let me know.
I can jump in real quick. So yes, the study was done in conjunction with developing the task force. So because the Green Roof Initiative was strictly a citizen passed initiative. So it was, on the ballot and passed, and then immediately it was there. From there, then they were looking at how to kind of cater it more to Denver. So that's when the larger studies started to happen of, what is needed, how do we get this implemented, and then looking at where those areas are the most vulnerable.
Yeah, and we had our cool roof ordinance and our green roof rules pre-established before we did our heat mapping. But our heat mapping has been really useful for, one, pointing out that where we've been encouraging a lot of the cool policies might not be where we need them. And so it's stretching us to think a little bit more creatively. They have also been tremendously helpful for the community discussions around heat and really making heat feel more tangible to folks. And, people are like, oh yeah, my neighborhood is hotter than this other neighborhood. And so that has been really helpful. And then we have used those original heat maps to build on and do that second heat modeling study to really try and understand which interventions we want to start encouraging more. And someone just chatted me and is correct that the tool that we used for that was NVMet. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to www.envi-met.com.
Great, thanks guys. Another one for you, Melissa. Were the cooler indoor air temperatures resulting from the green and cool roofs considered in your analysis?
So it was not, because what we were particularly interested in that study was outdoor temperature at the pedestrian level, just because we had to choose what we wanted to focus on for that particular small research study. But the indoor air temperature and energy efficiency criteria are super important for us as the district, because we also are working on installing or implementing building energy performance standards for the district, and very ambitious green building codes. So that plays a role in encouraging some of those policies too.
Great, thank you. This is for both of you, perhaps. Do you know of any examples of policies or regulations which have been effective in reducing heat island impacts in industrial areas? That's not necessarily.
Yeah, admittedly, that's not something that we have specifically looked at, though I think they're going to be many of the same things that work in other places. It's just you might be more limited in terms of how space can be used, but if you can integrate trees, if you can integrate cool materials into those industrial spaces, that seems like it would be helpful, but it is not something we've specifically analyzed.
Yeah, I agree with Melissa. The use of those spaces are, quite different. But in terms of the green building ordinance, it does apply to all buildings at a certain size. So if they do meet that size, which a lot of them would, then the green building ordinance would start to apply to those. So they'd have to do the cool roofs and add green space or one of those other provisions.
Great, and I would say because industrial buildings have flat roofs, they're really good candidates for green roofs and cool roofs. So it is kind of an area of a city that's ripe for cooling down. And because the building owners will see reductions in their energy bills from both of those types of roofs, I think it gives them a good incentive. So something to think about in our policies. Let's see. Okay, this might be a tough one. Melissa, I've been researching U.S. cities' heat advisory temperatures. DC activates its emergency heat plan when the heat index is 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is one of the lowest I've seen. Do you know if it has always been this low, or was it recently reduced? Is there any possibility of reevaluating it or things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love it. That has always been the temperature as long as I have been in district government. So that's, the last 4 years. We actually lowered it unofficially during COVID, even more, where I believe we opened our cooling centers really anytime it was above 90 degrees, just because we recognized that people were staying at home and may not have access to the same air conditioning that they otherwise would have access to. Our cooling centers generally were a little bit less used because I think people were reticent to go to them during COVID, but that was an extra precaution that the district took. One of the conversations that we're actively having is, do we want to tier our heat emergency activations? Right now it's sort of on or off. And we've actually heard the criticism that we have too many heat emergency days and people become kind of inured to them, where they're just not paying attention anymore. They get this alert every day in the summer, and so they start ignoring them. So we have talked about whether we want to have, a code red heat emergency day that is a higher temperature or a longer heat wave or something like that. We haven't quite figured out what that would look like, but that's an active conversation we're having.
Interesting. And I know the National Weather Service, well, maybe I should not speak for our NOAA folks, but there is some work being done at the federal level to try to help with messaging and helping people understand what does an advisory mean for heat versus a watch, and how can we convey better to the public, as you were saying, Melissa, what the what is really, when it gets really serious, not to ignore any of those warnings, but what is the difference between a hot day and then like a super hot day? So appreciate that question. Here's a really good one, not an easy one. Maybe not, I don't know, sorry. What types of opposition to the plans and regulations were encountered, or are you currently seeing being encountered? Some opposition. What reasons were they giving? What are the stakeholder groups they're coming from? Sort of how have you managed to navigate them?
So, oh, go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, widespread opposition. There's always some opposition when you're requiring building developers to do more. And I think our building developer community is easier than some other cities. But just how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to continue, delivering on our affordable housing goals when you're making it more expensive to build a building? So that has come up. I think the other opposition that we've gotten is with some of our tree canopy work. Often the trees that we're planting are small and they will take years to actually grow and provide canopy. And so people aren't immediately seeing the benefits of those, or that they find that the park space that we're creating doesn't feel accessible or safe. So that's where I think it's really important to just continue to have the community conversations and talking about how we can do a little bit better, how we can strategically think about where we're putting our mature trees versus our less mature trees.
Yeah, I would certainly say that. Especially from the perspective that a lot of I think people see requirements as something that's based, and that's a pretty minimum thing to have to achieve. But these requirements aren't necessarily that easy for every building to achieve. So some buildings, especially on the existing building side, will have to do a little bit of work to get that. But that's why there's so many different compliance options, because putting all solar on a building might not work for you. So there's other options to work with the green space. And that's why, from the community support side, it was really good that it did come from a voter initiative, because that's what the city of Denver voted on. So a majority of people did want this. So it was just trying to work out those kinks of how do we make this feasible for the community, and achievable, but also not something that every building already has. Otherwise, we wouldn't be going anywhere.
That's true. Yeah. Great. Thanks. Here's one for Melissa, and I'm sorry, this person submitted it earlier and I forgot to mention it. Or I guess it could be for both of you. Did your discussions about cool roofs include potential increases in cold weather related mortalities, or increasing the heating energy requirements during the winter? I think those of us in this space call that the winter heating penalty. So who wants to take that on?
It's something that comes up a little bit, but it was not a major consideration or concern for us. If a roof is covered in snow, it is already white and reflective. And so that sort of negates some of that. We're also expecting our winters to get warmer and to be shorter. So overall, our risk to extreme heat outweighs that winter penalty.
Yeah. I think, some studies have shown that some climates do need to do more heating with cool roofs in the wintertime, but it's definitely doesn't outweigh what you would get from the cooling. And also with the sun being at a different angle in the winter and less sun, you actually don't get that. You don't get reflection of the sun as much during the day to increase heating needs. Therefore, okay, let's see. How are we doing on time? There's some comments in the some website links that have been added to the question box for the audience on this discussion we were talking about as far as heat advisories and difference in terminology. I think, let me just do one more that one of our friends, sorry. Okay. This is from Melissa. How does DC plan to validate the results of the tree planting and the projected outcomes you did through modeling? Do you plan to measure actual temperatures or do field measurements? No, I know those aren't easy.
Yeah, so it's an unfunded dream currently, but yeah, I would like to do some real-time monitoring. We are doing tree planting, we are doing green infrastructure installs, we are doing green roof installs every day in the district. So it would be great to do some before and after temperature monitoring. It would take some time. I've talked to folks in Melbourne, Australia, that have done the study. So other cities are pursuing something similar. So there are models for doing it. I just need to connect the funding to the work.
I totally hear you. I know Madison, Wisconsin has used field measurements as well, but and then there's, all the great citizen science projects that have come out of the NOAA CAPA work, but I think it's very challenging to do kind of that before and after, where you don't have any greenery and you measure the temperature and then you install some greenery and what is the benefit. The good news is, though, I think temperatures in buildings and the roofs can be easily measured, and so you can immediately see the difference in the temperature that you're getting from a green roof or a cool roof in the building. And I think I found sometimes that really helps with policymakers to show them that at least the temperature in the building is better and we're saving on electricity. And then, of course, all the greenhouse gases and other things that come with that. Well, I think we actually covered all the questions, and if I missed you, I'm really sorry. We will, you can reach out to each of the speakers separately to follow up. I'm going to turn it back to Morgan to bring us home.
Thanks so much, Victoria, and thank you so much to our amazing panelists and everyone who asked some questions today. It led to some really great discussions. And so as we end our third webinar, we would like to invite everyone to join us on September 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern for our next webinar in the series. We're continuing our investigative options theme, and we'll be examining the structural and physical infrastructure, which features communities that have implemented solutions to make their built environment cooler and more resilient to heat. And with that, thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar, and a special thanks to our amazing speakers, Victoria, Melissa, and Courtney, and everyone who worked behind the scenes to make this webinar possible. We look forward to seeing everyone again on the 13th.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Morgan.